prove that it's a gender thing? Because two of those three issues you mentioned, just at a very superficial analysis, to me feel like they are race issues. I mean, terrorism, we think of Muslims as the picture that's being painted, right?
Yep.
And street crime, black people for sure, and we see that
Yes.
black people are incarcerated at much higher levels, percentage-wise. So sell the idea that it is actually gendered in there somewhere.
Okay. Well, no, I appreciate your point here, but it's a racialized gender analysis.
Okay.
So it's not. I'm not saying it's one or the other.
Sure.
I'm saying that let's add gender to our understanding of what have been understood as racialized issues. So, for example, the street crime issue, which emerged in the 1960s and 1970s as an important political issue that the right really ran with, if you will. If you listen to the kind of rhetoric that was thrown at Democrats and liberals and progressives about crime, it was things like you're soft on crime, you're coddling criminals. Who coddles somebody in the real world?
Mothers
coddle babies, right? So in other words, it's feminizing. In other words, what we need is a tough man, a tough white man in that racially subtextual sense, to get tough with these African-American rioters and criminals. And the liberals are a bunch of wimps and wusses and feminized men who aren't up to that task. That's an example of a gendered racial subtext. And terrorism is similar. Tough on terrorism versus soft on terrorism. And it's amazing how the Republican Party has been able to frame the Democratic Party, which includes all kinds of guys who are veterans like John Kerry, who had actually proven, quote unquote, their valor in war in ways that some of the Republican candidates like George W. Bush haven't. In spite of that real world record, they've been able to feminize these men. And in part, by the way, the Kerry piece was he was feminized in a class sense because of his class baggage, if you will. And for example, the picture of him what's the word? Skiing on the.
He was windsurfing.
Windsurfing off of like in Nantucket or something. Yeah. While his advisors might have thought that made him look athletic and made him look robust.
Elitist.
The read is elitist. And by the way, even the term elitist is a gendered term. It's one of the ways that wealthy men have been feminized by a sort of working class discourse.
Sure.
As a way of saying that they might have money, they might have more status, and in an abstract sense, they might have more power, but they're kind of wusses. They're kind of not really manly. There's an anti-intellectualism that runs deep in American culture, and Richard Hofstadter's book, Anti-Intellectualism in American Life, published in, I think, 1964, I think it's currently applicable today. It's a brilliant analysis of the roots of anti-intellectualism, but anti-intellectualism has a gendered tone because in male culture, intellectual achievement is often seen as, when I say male culture, I'm talking about like sort of sports bar kind of guy culture, kind of the mainstream, sort of guy culture. Intellectual attainment and polysyllabic speech is gendered feminine. Like, guys don't talk like that. So look at George W. Bush. I mean, downplaying his aristocratic roots, downplaying his Ivy League education, affecting a Texas blue-collar swagger, and being seen, therefore, somehow as more authentic. As a guy who you could relate to, as then say somebody like John Kerry, who's much more erudite, who's much more intellectual and cerebral. Al Gore, another example. I mean, so this is how it plays out in a cultural, political way. The elitism as sort of masculine effeminacy.
Can we talk a little bit about Sarah Palin specifically, and if we include Michelle Bachmann or Christine O'Donnell in that, fine. Something we saw a lot in the recent years has been some women's groups have criticized those who criticize Sarah Palin as saying that what's behind the criticism is that Sarah Palin is a woman. And it has been turned in a way that I haven't seen recently into Democrats are the ones who are against women's rights. What's your thought about that narrative and generally about what we've seen around Sarah Palin and other candidates?
Well, it's a complicated. Sarah Palin is as we would say in the academic sense, a complicated text. There's no question about it, and that's one of the reasons why she's a compelling sort of cultural figure. Yeah. However, some of us might feel about her politics. She has something. She represents something that's very interesting. And one of the things, to be honest, David, that I'm most interested in about Sarah Palin is how she's popular with a lot of white male conservative men who are sexist and traditionalist, and the idea of them supporting for president, and that now again, who knows if that's going to end up happening? She's never ran for a president, but
I don't believe it will.
Okay, but she was in that discourse, and she still is, right? The idea that a white conservative man would potentially support her for president, is really notable. And I have to think, why is that? What about what Sarah Palin is saying and doing and representing would cause a white man who does, a conservative, traditionalist, sexist white man or chauvinist white man to support her? And one of the things that I think is really interesting is what's going on is that she attacks liberal and progressive men's masculinity whenever she has the opportunity, which has the effect of supporting conservative men's masculinity. In other words, she boosts. Michelle Bachmann does it. Ann Coulter. That's one of the features of Ann Coulter's public life is that she goes on college campuses and elsewhere and just ridicules progressive and liberal men. And young conservative guys are eating it up because what she's basically saying is those guys who disagree with you, those guys who stand with the feminists and stand with progressive activists, they're a bunch of neutered wimps. Real men are right-wing Republicans.
And Christine O'Donnell, one of her, we would talk about her key and choice phrases during her campaign. She actually said her male opponent needed to man up. So it was not that she was able to get in on the action too.
That's right. And Sharon Engel said something similar as well.
That's right, yeah.
There is some criticism of Sarah Palin from the left that is sexist in its nature. And I think obviously that's the tricky part, because how do you criticize her and really identify the offensive nature of some of the things that she says and believes without playing into the sexism? It's a complicated, it's a complicated task.
To take a bigger picture look in the last couple of minutes here, to you, just your opinion, is the ideal scenario one where gender would be such a non-issue when we are electing candidates or whatever that it would not even warrant discussion? I mean, is that the ideal scenario? Or no matter what, is gender on the list of whatever else is on that list, it doesn't matter, that is always worth discussion, no matter what happens in terms of the discourse in the next 20, 30, 40 years?
Well, I mean, I think one of the ways to think about that is the same way that some people would look at, do we live in a post-racial society or do we not? And I think it's obvious that we do not.
Right.
And even though we elected an African-American man president, of course, racism and race is incredibly important. And I don't see in my lifetime that it's not going to be incredibly important. And I think gender is the same thing. And maybe someday in some far distant future, gender won't be significant, but I don't think we're anywhere close to that.
But my question is, given that there are a number of different things that we can discuss about what make people different, right? Uh-huh. And we could have a long laundry list, hundreds, maybe even thousands of things. Is gender such an important one, separate from where we are today because of what's happened and all of the things that you and I have discussed so far? Is it such an inherent part of how people are different that it always warrants discussion? Or could you imagine a situation where gender is no longer something that is do you see where I'm going with this?
Yeah, but I think that's utopian. I think
it's completely utopian.
It's so far in the future that it's like science fiction.
Yeah.
Sophisticated thinking requires us to make intersectional observations about gender and race and class and how it's all embedded. And if we got more men and women engaged in this conversation, I think its power, that is gender's power as a dividing force, if you will, would be diminished. But I think we would have more progressive politics if there was more consciousness about how, sort of masculinity is linked to conservative ways of thinking about the world, which affects politics. If we could make that visible, it would have less power, and therefore we'd have more progressive politics. I
would take it a step further, and what we've been saying for years on the show, if we had more nuanced, cross-platform, cross-genre analysis of almost any issue, we would have more progressive politics and more progressive people. That's just my thought. Jackson Katz, anti-sexist activist, author, expert on violence, media, masculinity. Great to have you in studio today. And your website, jacksonkatz.com.
Yes. Thank you very much. It's been great to be with you.
Thanks.